Hello, and welcome to Autocracy Now! This episode is part of our series on Stalin. It's episode 11, The Big Three and the Bomb. In the summer of 1944, it was the turn of the Red Army to launch a strategic offensive in the warm weather. This was Operation Bagration, named after an old Tsarist commander. Now, it was the Soviet T-34 tanks that were the invincible armoured columns, and it was the German High Command that failed to anticipate where the main thrust of the attack would come. This time, it was through Poland, Hungary, and Belarus. When you read the Nazi war diaries from the fall of France or Barbarossa, quite often you get a sense of elation in extraordinary victory. Here, that same elation is tempered by hatred and the desire for revenge. A grim fact of the war is that, as conquerors often have, the Red Army engaged in mass rape of women. As many as 2 million German women were raped as the Soviets advanced on Berlin. Stalin, for his part, had a sanguine, philosophical attitude towards this horrendous crime. When the leader of the Yugoslav resistance to the Nazi occupation complained to Stalin about these rapes in Yugoslav territory, he was happy to justify their behaviour. He said, "You have of course read Dostoevsky? Do you see what a complicated thing is man's soul? Well then, imagine a man who has fought from Stalingrad to Belgrade, over thousands of kilometres of his own devastated land, over the dead bodies of his comrades and dearest ones. How can such a man react normally? And what is so awful about his having fun with a woman after such horrors? You have imagined the Red Army to be ideal, and it is not, nor can it be. The important thing is that it fights Germans." End quote. The bizarre mix of empathy for the soldiers and utter disregard for the horrors inflicted on the civilians in the war leaves you wondering how much Stalin really cared about either. This was a sanitized version of his real opinion, to please the Yugoslav partisans. Stalin's real attitude was more reflected in a briefing by Marshal Zhukov as his troops approached Berlin. He said, "We have not forgotten the pain and suffering done to our people by the Hitlerist cannibals. We shall exact a brutal revenge for everything." It is true that the Red Army would have seen enough evidence of the Nazi Holocaust, and known enough first-hand evidence of the destruction of Soviet lands, that they could have little compassion for the nation they were fighting. But the fact that he was willing to use this as a justification, and took little action to stop violent retribution against the German people, is evidence enough of Stalin's brutality during the war. Almost everyone who came through the war, on either side, ended up being a victim or a participant in mass violence. They had all witnessed some of the most horrendous scenes imaginable. Yet it is the people of Poland who suffered the most. As the Red Army liberated more and more of the territory of Eastern Europe, and it became clear that they were occupiers as much as liberators, Polish patriots of the Polish Home Army rose in rebellion. This was the Warsaw Rising, a desperate attempt by the Poles to liberate their capital from the Nazis. They did so in the full fear and knowledge that the Red Army invaders would reconquer and resubjugate them, even if they succeeded. The Rising was timed to coincide with the Red Army approaching the city, but the Red Army advance stalled as the Rising began. Now this has been debated endlessly in the historiography of the war. Soviet commanders like Zhukov insist that the Red Army was never in a position to take Warsaw, but there's some damning evidence. The fact that they refused radio contact and refused to supply the Poles by air, and they refused to reinforce them, and all these things suggest that Stalin was perfectly happy to let them fight, and let Polish resistance and patriotism be crushed by the Nazis. After all, we have to remember that he organised the massacre at the Katyn forest to do just that. This way, the Nazis might be held responsible. Regardless of whether the Red Army was genuinely incapable of helping the Poles, or if this was just a strategic move, and declassified documents from Soviet archives do suggest that Stalin did want to cut off the Poles from outside help, the results were awful for Poland. The Nazis crushed the Rising with military force, and as many as 200,000 civilians were killed, with most of the rest being deported. Fanatical orders demanded the total destruction of the Polish capital, with the horrendous figures of the SS taking charge, and the USSR did little to help. It should be pointed out that the RAF and the US Air Force resupplied the Poles by air, while the Soviets were only a few miles away. I once listened to the story of a concentration camp survivor, a man who was a young boy at the time of the Warsaw Rising, but was still drafted into the Polish Home Army and threw a grenade or two before being captured. Shipped further west into Germany as a prisoner of war, he wound up in a concentration camp. By this stage, late in 1944 and early 1945, the exterminations had become even more schizophrenic than before. In some regions they stopped entirely, while in others, fanatical SS officers redoubled their efforts. The man was simply left alone without food, to starve to death. When the Allies liberated the camp, he was in a room full of bodies, too weak to move or make any sound. The only reason his life was saved was that a soldier happened to notice that, unlike the others, he was still breathing. A return to Poland meant a return to Soviet occupation, which was only lifted in 1989. I met that man when I was 15, that's 7 years ago. Chances are he's dead now, but he spent the later years of his life at Auschwitz telling that story to everyone who came to see. After the defeat at Kursk in 1943, and the opening of a second front by the Western Allies, the Second World War might as well have been over. It was becoming increasingly clear that the Wehrmacht had suffered permanent reverses in the field, and the massive defeats of Operation Bagration hastened the decline. But this was no ordinary war, it was fought as a war of extermination with near unprecedented brutality. And this, as much as anything else, is what led to its protraction. The German soldiers felt they had no choice but to fight on, in the hope of defending home soil against the terrible retribution that was doubtless coming. Average citizens may have been unaware of the extent of the violence on the front and the extent of the Holocaust, but they are under no illusions that invasion and occupation would be painless. I mean, these people had listened to years of propaganda talking about the ravenous communists who were going to kill them all. And Hitler, spiralling further and further away from reality, became obsessed with the Gottendammerung, the twilight of the gods. Completing the task of world domination he had in mind for them, then they would be annihilated. He was determined to take as many people down with him as possible. The traditional sign-off from Stalin's daily orders, which read, "Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in the struggle for freedom and independence of our motherland, and death to the German invaders," was closer and closer to reality. As it became clear that the war was being won and lost, Stalin's attention and that of his Western counterparts shifted to what would happen after the war. None of them were under any illusions that their alliance would last for longer than it took to defeat Hitler. Communism and capitalism were fundamentally opposed ideologies, and frays in the relationship had already begun to develop, for example, in the different responses to the Warsaw Uprising that was described last time. Yet Stalin, despite public posturing, was convinced that there was not going to be another war. He said, "People are tired of war. No war is possible for at least the next 20 years. The democracies would not elect warlike leaders. Indeed, Churchill was booted out in 1945 by the British electorate, probably because they thought he wasn't the man to lead the peace. So, Stalin was right about that. Stalin always admired Churchill, considering him the strongest of the capitalists. And when, at one of their conferences, Churchill explained to Stalin that he might not be in power after the war, saying, "You see, we have two parties," Stalin, with his sardonic wit, noted that one is better. Even in autocracies, public opinion can be important. If Stalin had insisted on using the Red Army to roll into France on ideological grounds, to turn them into communists, he would surely have risked an uprising in his own country. So it was clear that some kind of new equilibrium would have to be established when the fighting stopped. It was this, as much as anything else, that was the focus of the conferences between Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt, the big three leaders, that took place during the war. Stalin and Churchill actually had their earliest conference in August of 1941, when Churchill visited to state that there would be no chance of a second front being opened up anytime soon. He didn't realise it at the time, but the luxurious building that Churchill was put up in was Stalin's own dacha. The conference got off to a terrible start because of the lack of a second front, which, at a critical phase of the war, was not taken well by Stalin. Reportedly, after feeling insulted, Churchill wanted to storm off before he'd been scheduled to leave. But eventually the two got on better after Stalin charmed Churchill with a few personal touches, a drink in his apartment, and letting Churchill meet Svetlana. The first Big Three meeting took place in Tehran in November 1943, which was as close to neutral territory as it was possible to get at the time. Stalin was reportedly deeply unnerved when his plane hit an air pocket. One has to consider that he was hardly a roving leader, preferring to stay in Moscow or at his holiday dacha. and the nature of the Soviet state meant that diplomatic trips to other nations weren't especially common. He had a well-documented fear of flying and very rarely went in an aeroplane. The meetings took place in the Soviet embassy complex in Tehran, and naturally every room was swarming with Beria's bugs. These meetings are fascinatingly complex, and historians have focused on them since with good reason. As humans, I think we're always better at understanding, or maybe just more interested in, the human intrigue on small scales rather than the large-scale strategic movements, or long-term trends and forces. Providing you have more than one friend or family member, you'll understand the complexity of the dynamics that can evolve between three people. Each of Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt represented era-defining rulers of their country, undoubtedly great minds and remarkable individuals. And each of them arrived with a different set of biases, a different agenda, and a different point of view on the best way of expressing that agenda. And the questions were not minor ones. Was there going to be a second front? When and where would it be opened? How much credit could the United States extend to the other two nations? How would Germany and the other Axis powers be dealt with after the war? After all, the Treaty of Versailles had practically led to the Second World War in a lot of people's opinion, so that was not a minor question. What would happen to the Eastern European countries, both those which Stalin had occupied because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler, and those which the Red Army would surely end up occupying as the war progressed? Roosevelt, for his part, was concerned that Stalin would clam up, view the capitalists as teaming up against him and issuing ultimatums. For this reason, he attempted to side with Stalin against Churchill on a number of occasions. The tactic worked, and Stalin had always admired Roosevelt and seemed personally fascinated by him, even though he probably respected Churchill's defiance more. Both Stalin and FDR had the capacity to be incredibly charming when they wanted to be. Indeed, there were many people who, based on their meetings with Stalin, had a wonderful impression of the Bolshevik. I mean, here's an example. There was a young private who, at the height of the war, took to soothing his nerves in the Russian manner with some vodka, and one day he came in to deliver a report to Stalin unexpectedly after a drinking session. And, he slurs his way through this report, and Stalin says to him, "Have you been drinking?" And the young man goes, Yes, I have, Comrade Stalin." And he says, "Well, that's fine, just don't do it again." So you can kind of see the sort of avuncular, jolly nature of Stalin in this quite serious situation here. And you can kind of see why a lot of people were willing to attribute the greatest repressions of the terror to Yezhov and Beria, because he could be charming when he needed to be. In the manner of all psychopaths, I suppose. His closest associates and confidants, however, had a more rounded view. Of course, geopolitical considerations, as well as personal charm, came into play. Now you have to remember at this time the British Empire was still considerable. They still controlled India. FDR mentioned that India was ripe for a revolution, which was surely a mark designed to please Stalin and undermine the British Empire. Of course, the Empire was against the American ideal of self-determination that had been the dominant philosophy they expressed at similar negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, because self-determination would mean that the British Empire would break up. An infamous episode happened when Stalin remarked, 50,000 or perhaps 100,000 German officers should be executed to prevent the country from rising up again. And in there you can see a similar line of repression to Katyn that he wanted to do to Germany. But Churchill, he took offence to this. He said that the British public would never support the execution of honest men who'd fought for their country. Roosevelt, playing for an audience of one, joked that maybe they could get away with only shooting 49,000. Churchill was offended and tempted to storm off, but Roosevelt and Stalin reassured him that they were only kidding. However, that year, Beria and his security forces would arrest nearly 1 million people in the liberated territories. I'd be willing to bet that well over 50,000 had been executed already. If you think that maybe they could have come up with slightly funnier punchlines while they were debating real people's lives, I'm with you all the way. Yet this incident was indicative of Roosevelt's desire to curry favour with Stalin at Churchill's expense. Another recurring theme of the Tehran Conference was Stalin's habit of showing his dominance and power over the state by tormenting his underlings. Molotov, Beria and others all came in for criticism and were frequently the butt of diplomatic jokes. Stalin never ceased to enjoy reminding people of his power. The main results of Tehran were the agreement that the D-Day landings would take place in 1944, but another interesting aspect was that the Allies agreed to fund and support the Yugoslav partisans, communists who were fighting the Nazis behind their own lines. Now, the state of Yugoslavia had been set up in the Treaty of Versailles as a sort of buffer between Russia and Germany, ensuring that neither of them was too powerful, but here they were essentially ceding them to the communists. They had essentially become quite a thorn in the side of the occupying forces. Churchill noted that the Yugoslav partisans were holding up almost as many German divisions as the invasion of Italy had done in 1943. Their commander was one Josip Broz Tito, and one day I hope we'll do a series on him. The borders of post-war Poland were also discussed, albeit hastily on the last day of the conference. The real carve-up would come later on. The one purpose that I can see that there was for continually fighting the war was that it allowed in some cases for German civilians and soldiers to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Red Army, which would usually result in better treatment. In the corridors of power, the fate of millions was being decided. Not that the negotiations did all that much aside from keeping the peace. Stalin knew that if push came to shove, his armies would be the ones occupying the territory that he wanted to claim, and there would be very little that the democracies could do to protest against it. Churchill at one point negotiated what he called a naughty document with Stalin, where the two divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, the inevitable precursors to the Eastern Bloc and the Iron Curtain that would divide Europe. I mean, this naughty document was on the back of a newspaper. In the end, though, the stipulations of the document made little difference. Stalin was able to do pretty much everything he wanted. The conference at Yalta took place in February of 1945, and the focus had turned entirely to the post-war settlement of Europe. Once again, they all arrived with separate agendas. Roosevelt, who knew that the atomic bomb was close to completion but had no way of knowing that it would end the war in the Pacific, needed Stalin on side to win that war. It's easy to forget with the way that history turned out, but the US Army had battle plans drawn up for an invasion of the Japanese mainland, and given the kamikaze tactics and stolid resistance of the Japanese, which was intensifying as the war approached closer to home territory, millions of American soldiers would likely have died. In fact, Roosevelt was able to negotiate at Yalta an invasion of Manchuria, the region of China that Japan occupied. This invasion took place on the 9th of August, 3 days after the first atomic bomb had dropped on Hiroshima, and hours before the second was dropped on Nagasaki. So the Japanese unconditional surrender was not entirely due to the atomic bombs, although of course they played a huge part. Important factors that were often forgotten, alongside the Russian invasion, are the extensive, demoralising firebombing raids on Tokyo that took place before the atomic bombings, which killed more people than the nuclear weapons did, and the Japanese knew that they'd be facing a war on two fronts against Russia as well as the US. Churchill was principally concerned with democratic governments in the countries under Soviet occupation, especially Poland, which was really why Britain had entered the war in the first place. For his part, though, Stalin was not going to let that happen. You feel that in 1945 the carve-up of Europe was for completely different motivations than when Lenin had championed the invasion of Poland in 1920. Then, the socialist ideology was front and centre, and this was an internationalist tactic to spread the revolution. Now, Stalin wanted a buffer zone of territory to prevent future invasions from affecting Russia, and to increase the power of his empire in general. Yet he was willing to pay lip service to the idea of democracy, saying, "The Soviet Union is interested in the creation of a mighty, free, and independent Poland." But as we all know, the writing was on the wall with the massacre at Katyn, and the one that the Red Army had failed to prevent in Warsaw. But Churchill seemed to believe that Stalin's promise of free elections was real. He said, "Poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong. But I don't think I am wrong about Stalin." The naivete of this statement might seem astonishing now, but we have to remember that Churchill didn't know what we now know about the Stalinist regime. It's also fair to say he didn't have much of a choice. Regardless of intentions, the net result was that the Polish government in exile, and the Polish pilots who'd flown alongside the RAF during the Battle of Britain, were sold down the river. Another dark underside to the settlement negotiated at Yalta was that the Big Three agreed that all the Russian prisoners of war, including Cossacks and other minority ethnic groups, would be repatriated. In a lot of cases, this massive transfer of prisoners of war put them straight back into the grim apparatus of the NKVD, and it meant arrest, torture, and execution. After all, not one step back. Roosevelt was also heartened when he came away from Yalta with the promise of Japanese intervention, as well as the fact that Stalin had agreed to take the USSR into the United Nations. With the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious that Stalin was just toying with the idea of the United Nations to please Roosevelt. He negotiated favourable terms, such as the veto that all members of the Security Council would have, allowing the USSR to defend its own interests. In fact, it used 109 out of 128 of the vetoes before 1973. And, as well as this, Stalin negotiated that individual socialist republics of his occupied countries could be admitted to the UN, stacking the deck in his favour. But the precedent was clear at this point. I mean, the League of Nations had been established after the First World War for the same purpose, and as soon as the great powers disagreed with each other, the Soviet Union just left. It joined when it suited them, left when it suited them. Stalin's apparent concession to joining the UN was completely empty. He probably felt that if he ever needed to, he'd just leave. And in a nuclear age, when the war starts, the UN is not going to have much of an effect. As well as the master statesman, or at any rate the statesman with the biggest army, Yalta showcased the aspects of Stalin's personality that had become so familiar to us. When the Pope discussed, Churchill said they should make him their ally. Stalin replied, "Yes, all right, but how many divisions does the Pope have?" It was an old joke of his, which he liked to repeat all the time. But the triumph of force over ideals says everything about the motivation behind Yalta. It's ironic, really. Here's a man who came to power on a sweeping Marxist revolution, the idea being that the thought, the word, the concept of freedom, socialism, equality, was more powerful than all of the institutions of state. And yet, here he is now, running that state. And he's the man who thinks that words, concepts, like freedom, are useless compared to force, in just the same way as the Tsar would have done. He took the opportunity to humiliate Beria by comparing him to Himmler, whose vast Holocaust was beginning to be revealed. And, in another dark hint of things to come, he was aiming this probably at the increasingly prestigious Marshal Zhukov. He said, "The services of the generals are quickly forgotten after the war. Here's to them! After the war, their prestige goes down and the ladies turn their back on them." And yet, at the same time as humiliating the people who'd served him, he even displayed genuine sympathy behind closed doors for the ailing Roosevelt, who he admired. He said, "What did Roosevelt do? Why has God chosen to make him this way?" It's a bizarre quote to hear that from Stalin. When Roosevelt died a few weeks later, he was upset, and Stalin would later unfavourably compare Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor, to his old favourite. At Yalta, the underlying menace of the Red Army and the de facto control of so much territory meant that Stalin held most of the cards. A member of the delegation summed it up. It wasn't a question of what we would let the Russians do, but what we could get them to do. However, he wouldn't hold all the cards for long, because the US were just months away from successfully testing a nuclear bomb. 2 months later, in the bunker, Hitler, Goebbels, and others committed suicide, and the little-known Admiral Dönitz was elevated to the position of Führer. Unconditional surrender was quickly negotiated as the Red Army already occupied Berlin, which had been defended by the press-ganged elderly and the Hitler Youth. Hitler did not succeed, as he had hoped, in bringing the entire German people down with him. In terms of the leaders' reactions, Churchill reportedly said, "I must say that I think he was perfectly right to die like that." Stalin's response was a little bit more blunt. "So that's the end of the bastard. Too bad we couldn't take him alive." What had been billed as a clash of ideologies, fascism versus communism, or could be viewed as a clash of titanic historical figures, Hitler versus Stalin, had really, of course, had far less to do with any of these factors than people liked. It was a class of nations, populations, and armies. The Soviet Union had been utterly devastated by it, with as many as 27 million of its own citizens killed, easily more than every other nation combined except for China, and fully 14% of the pre-war population. In occupied regions, the figures were far worse as they faced the double threat from the Nazis and from the Soviets. As many as a quarter of the Belarusians died in the war. The retreating Nazis systematically destroyed towns and villages, and millions of people were displaced. The USSR was victorious, but it had suffered damage that would take decades to recover from. Yet the victory in Berlin was surely the zenith of Stalin's career. For defeating the Nazis, he has received the grudging admiration of history and historians. Victory in the war, after the fact, has been used by many Stalin apologists and close comrades to justify the worst excesses of the pre-war regime. The Great Terror was necessary in order to win the war. The chaos and disruption of the 5-year plans was necessary in order to rearm the country to win the war. The Great Terror had unified the USSR and prevented the regime from being toppled in order to win the war. Now, the idea that the 5-year plan was necessary is far more valid than the idea that the Great Terror was necessary. You probably guessed by now that I'm not keen to absolve Stalin of anything. It seems clear that the idiosyncrasies of his personality meant that the world was filled with far more violence and far more destruction than it would have been otherwise. And although it's a fun game to play, engaging with counterfactuals is a dangerous game as well. What if, for example, Trotsky had prevailed instead of Stalin? The insistent focus on international revolution would have probably led to violent conflict. If Bukharin and the rightists had continued with the NEP for longer, it's perfectly possible that the Soviet economy would not have been capable of producing the armaments in order to win the war. Leaving aside philosophical considerations about the ends justifying the means, though, I don't think you can make a good argument for the Great Terror. The evidence is damning that both the purges themselves and the culture of fear and refusing to question authority that they created were hugely detrimental for the USSR, and the Red Army especially. The evidence for any genuine conspiracy was almost entirely fabricated. It seems unlikely that there would have been a vast cadre of pro-German fascists in the Soviet Union without the purges. And as we have discussed, Stalin's personal interventions in the war, his selection of backward-looking generals, his failure to anticipate Operation Barbarossa, and his failure to anticipate the attack in the Caucasus, did more harm than good. At the same time, we shouldn't compare Stalin to an unreasonably ideal military planner. If Tsar Nicholas II had improbably still been in charge in 1941, you feel that his government would have been toppled. He probably would never have even had the pragmatism to compromise with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which did buy the USSR 2 vital years. His decision to stay in Moscow with the Wehrmacht a few miles outside the city, when Beria and the like were screaming at him to evacuate, may have been an important factor in the critical point that the city was held. And the brutal, ruthless methods of the Bolsheviks and the Soviet system. It's difficult to say whether they made accomplishing short-term logistical miracles, like the reinforcement of Moscow from the east, easier or more difficult. But a simple analysis of the facts is enough to throw serious doubt on the idea that Stalin deserves the level of credit that he got for winning the war. Ultimately, we don't know what would have happened if he wasn't in charge. That's why history is so interesting. There are millions of variables and far few measured outcomes. We only get to run the simulation once, and then endlessly argue about which factors were the most important ones. All these caveats aside, the final victory at Berlin was the highlight of Stalin's career, and doubtless also the highlight of his life. Whatever Marxist ideology might say about him being just another comrade, and whatever his pragmatism in the 1920s, portraying himself as a lowly general secretary, might have shown to the world, he loved glory as much as the next tyrant. This was probably shown even in the early days of his Civil War command. He started secretly training to take the victory parade on horseback, but, as his son confessed to Zhukov, father had been preparing himself to take the parade, but the horse bolted. Stalin, a little bit sheepishly upstaged by a horse, let Zhukov ride the horse in the parade instead. There is a great deal of Roman history in these proceedings. The parade sounds exactly like a Roman triumph, with the flags and banners of the enemy trampled underfoot by the victors. Nazi flags were thrown at Stalin's feet. He was feted as a hero, the saviour of the Soviet Union, the conqueror of fascism, and the victor in the war. This was the zenith of his power, influence, and respect on the global stage as a statesman. His finest hour. The eyes of the world were fixed on the provincial nobody from some unknown village in Georgia. The complete control and micromanagement that Stalin had engaged in throughout the war, and the immense psychological stresses he'd undergone over the last 20 years, took a considerable toll on his health. At this point, he was 66 years old. Indeed, Svetlana Stalin reports that he had a mild heart attack just after the war, and he became increasingly reliant on trips to his doctors. He was declining. To even think this, let alone suggest it, was an incredibly risky prospect, but even Stalin had begun to talk about retirement. Like so many autocrats, the centralized nature of control does not lend itself well to regime change. Could you really run a Stalinist system by committee? So as soon as the war was over, even though nobody could possibly dare to speak about it, the succession games between Stalin's underlings began. Zhdanov was Stalin's favourite. Molotov had been with him the longest. Beria controlled the vast security apparatus of the NKVD. One person who was a possible successor to Stalin, despite his popularity and own personal merits, was Marshal Zhukov. Stalin probably already suspected and mistrusted him as he watched him ride the right stallion in the victory parade. After all, Zhukov had defied him during the war, and Stalin's own paranoia about military coups has always been clear, like when he persecuted Tukhachevsky. The Zhukov-Stalin dynamic is one of the more fascinating ones in this era. Like all the other great men surrounding Stalin, Zhukov learned how to read his capricious moods and react accordingly. But unlike Beria, whose response was usually to become more sycophantic and conform more closely to Stalin's views, Zhukov and Stalin had many arguments, and Stalin was often forced to back down. Beria and others would attempt to manipulate Stalin's own worldview by presenting them with information, but Zhukov was one of those who openly challenged it. So, what did this mean for them? Did this straightforwardness gain Stalin's respect? Did Stalin grudgingly acknowledge that if his generals had always been doormats, he would have made more mistakes? Historians have argued about Zhukov's genuine influence on the war, and his military strategies ever since. Some people accuse him of being very wasteful of human life, but regardless of the actual effectiveness, he was perceived by everyone, including Stalin, as the outstanding general of the war. Even after Zhukov's political downfall, Stalin did not have him executed, and refused to entertain the idea that he was really planning a coup, at least in private. He said, "Zhukov's a straight-talking man, but he'd never go against the CC." But the fact remained that Zhukov was immensely popular amongst the armed forces, and such people are always threats to autocrats. To make matters worse, Beria, who saw Zhukov as a threat to his succession, did everything he could to undermine him. There's a fascinating counterfactual that I can't resist going into here. Now, Zhukov never attempted a coup. In all likelihood, he didn't want to rule the USSR, or at the very least he didn't want to take the enormous gamble that an open power play against Stalin would entail. He was no politician. But his friendship with another Allied general, which developed at the conferences, has become notorious. Dwight Eisenhower, who would later of course be US President. Eisenhower always thought that Zhukov was too committed to Marxist ideals to betray the Communist Party. This may have been true, but he was also committed to peace between the two superpowers, and they exchanged friendly letters for years to come after the war. The two generals knew better than anyone else the hideous costs of war, and they were both focused on how they could maintain and establish peace. So if you're writing an alternative history novel, a premise where Zhukov seizes power in a coup, and détente between the USSR and the USA happens during the Eisenhower presidency in the 50s, it's a lot of fun. Maybe I'll get into it in a bonus episode for crazy counterfactual ramblings. Imagine being born in the late 1890s. Having endured 2 world wars and a Great Depression, you might just be looking forward to retirement when the atomic bomb was dropped in 1945. This, of course, was precisely what happened to Stalin. Stalin likely knew that the US had finished the atomic bomb before he was told, and certainly before it was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it didn't change the fact that, for all the might of the Red Army, it meant that the balance of power had shifted back towards the capitalists. His reaction when Truman informed him at Potsdam belied his own annoyance that his scientists hadn't got there in time. He said, "A new bomb, of extraordinary power, probably decisive on the Japanese. What luck!" Stalin knew that the threat of nuclear war would prove a powerful bargaining chip. Of course, it was this that hung over the Cold War, and therefore most of geopolitics for the next 50 years. But it has to be remembered that during the Cold War, doctrines such as mutually assured destruction limited the impact that the threat of nuclear war could have, diplomatically. But mutually assured destruction only works if the destruction is, well, mutually assured. As soon as the Soviets got the bomb, it would be apocalyptic for both parties to engage in a nuclear war, so it's not really a credible threat. Spheres of influence became the means by which the nuclear states could defend the interests of some of the non-nuclear states. But this equality was not the case in the few years after the Second World War, where the US had nuclear weapons and the Soviets did not. Stalin was not willing to be held over a barrel, and the Soviet efforts to develop their own bomb, which would have proved a useful tool in the Second World War, redoubled. The project was started in 1943, but progress was slow at first. It was an interesting side project for the Soviets. But now, in Stalin's view, as soon as the US dropped the bomb, it was completely necessary for them to maintain their power. As a physicist who knows a lot of physicists, the story of the bomb's development is a fascinating one for me. The stereotypes for physicists as socially awkward and mildly obsessive are not universally true, but they're true a statistically significant amount of the time. I've never fought in a war, and I can't even begin to truly empathise with the soldiers who did so, because it's so far from my realm of experience. To say that I can do is insulting to their memory. But a physicist, obliged to sit at a desk and calculate the most effective way to kill millions of people, as those who worked out the best way of conducting firebombing raids to produce terrible firestorms like the Allies caused in Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo. There's just enough shared experience that it touches me all the more to imagine what that might be like, knowing that the intellectual problem you're solving would lead to unimaginable destruction. The Soviet physicists who developed the atomic bomb had to contend with more than their own moral scruples. Frustrated with the slow progress with Molotov supervising the bomb's development, Stalin put Beria in charge the day after Hiroshima. He said, "Hiroshima has shaken the whole world. The balance has been destroyed, and this cannot be." The appointment of Beria, who was a good organiser, but of course far more famous for his brutality, would send shivers down your spine as a physicist. "You're a good worker," he'd say, "but a spell in the gulag would make you even better." The scientists and technicians, tens of thousands of them working on the project, were essentially his prisoners. Beria knew that if the project failed, the next man to wake up in an anonymous NKVD dungeon would be him. Stalin was willing to provide them with all of the economic resources they could need, but time was not something he was willing to compromise on. The Soviet attempt to build the atomic bomb would be run just as all Soviet projects were, a dramatic, revolutionary struggle to hastily achieve the goal by any means necessary, with the threat of terror lurking in the background. It was a nuclear physics 5 years plan, but they didn't have 5 years. Many of the scientists who worked there were prisoners in Sharaska, which were the technical expert gulags, where inmates were obliged to perform intellectual work. A lot of them had their work published anonymously, or credited to more politically correct scientists. I can't imagine how much that would annoy a physicist. They were locked up behind barbed wire in secret cities. There were some brilliant physicists in the Soviet Union. Sakharov, Kapitsa, Kirkachov and Landau all worked on the bomb, and many of them did their work out of intellectual curiosity, a sense of duty, or even for the philosophical reason that a nuclear balance might actually prevent war. Yet, the physicists I know would have chafed under the rule of someone who knew nothing about physics, demanding unreasonable progress and making thinly veiled threats. This is another show that I'd like to do, is just describing the development of the nuclear weapons by the Soviet scientists under Beria. I think it's just such an amazing dynamic, and if you're interested, I think I'll record an extra show on that. Stalin's attitude towards science was paradoxical at times. He understood the necessity of technical innovation to keep up with the West, and he was a strong supporter of scientific innovations, despite rarely understanding them himself. But at the same time, his politics was constantly in the picture. Scientists had been caught up in the Great Terror, along with the rest of the educational establishment. And after all, it makes sense, because they believe in an objective truth, independent of the party. Class issues came into play, as proletarian science was considered superior to bourgeois science. And science, of course, is just science. Ideally, it should be free from all political ideology. In some cases, the political influence was more direct. He championed the work of biologists who rejected natural selection and the theory of evolution. After all, its focus on the idea that the best traits were propagated by competition and survival of the fittest aren't very communist. Free market capitalism is pretty Darwinian. These interventions led to a persecution of geneticists in the USSR that did serious damage. In the case of physics, there was less scope for politically incorrect baryons and mesons, but politics was never absent. Stalin didn't want the scientists to be corrupted by outside influences. He championed theories developed by Russians and good communists especially, sometimes without much consideration for their scientific merit. The uneasy tension between copying the more advanced Western nuclear program and pioneering Soviet science was never really resolved. Stalin's political considerations would come ahead of the reality. Scientists were useful tools, but he had little time for their explanations of why access to and building on Western research was crucial. Yet with the bomb, he deferred to their expertise often. "Leave the physicists in peace," he'd say to Beria. "They're doing their job. We can always shoot them later." Sakharov, who often clashed with Beria, later became an outspoken critic of the regime and a human rights activist. Other physicists, like Landau, were persecuted by the regime. He rejoiced when Stalin died, saying that he was no longer afraid of him and would no longer work on the bomb. This is a fascinating intersection between science and politics, and the personal lives of the people concerned. Many of them got into science for idealistic reasons. Nuclear physics itself had then, and still has now, the potential secrets to unlocking vast sources of energy. How this energy is used is a human decision. They might have also thought that nuclear fusion was just a few decades away. They wanted to modernize the Soviet Union, as Stalin did, but with different methods and different motives. In the same way, the legacy of Soviet science, which brought a great many technological advances and had a great many fascinating but hidden figures, is complex. You can read what the scientists have to say about that work, and many of them report deeply mixed feelings. There was a community spirit. They were working on a fascinating and vital project that ended in world-changing success and rich financial reward, but they were threatened and deprived of their liberty. The heartlessness of the Soviet system, and the expendability of its people, was on display in the atomic program too, but the physicists were protected by their intellects or how they were seen. The quiet efforts of the physicists, locked away in their secret city, would produce remarkable success. By 1949, they had detonated a nuclear bomb. The rest of the 20th century would unfold in the shadow of nuclear war. Thank you for listening to Autocracy Now! You can email at us at autocracynow@outlook.com, follow us on Twitter, like our page on Facebook. Please, if you like us, rate us or review us on iTunes. That way I don't have to lock anyone in a secret city made of barbed wire and force them to listen to the podcast and review it, and it helps get us noticed. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, you can even donate to the show if you like. Next time, we will look at the shaping battle for Stalin's succession, and the increasing paranoia and mistrust he displayed in his declining years, as well as the post-war settlement in Europe. Until then, be kind to one another.